I remember the exact moment when my world turned upside down. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the sky was painting itself with the last hues of daylight, and I was expecting a quiet dinner with my wife, Emma. We had been married for 7 years, the kind of marriage that felt like a well-worn path, comfortable yet predictable. But that night, predictability shattered like glass. I came home from work, my mind still tangled with the day's meetings and deadlines. When I saw it, a text message on her phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter. The sender was a name I didn't recognize, but the content? That was unmistakable. "Can't wait for tonight, my love." My heart, which had been in its usual rhythm, skipped a beat, then plummeted into a freefall of disbelief. I confronted Emma as soon as she walked in. Her face, usually an open book, shut down. Her eyes, which could read mine like a child's story, now avoided mine like the plague. She confessed, not in a flood of tears as I might have expected, but with a chilling calm. She had been seeing someone else, someone she described with a reverence that stung more than the betrayal itself. "He was an alpha male," she said, as if that explained everything. That term, alpha male, echoed in my mind, a term from some primal, hierarchical world that had nothing to do with the life we had built together. She was seeing him for the thrill, the danger, the raw masculinity she felt I lacked. Each word she spoke was like a nail driven into the coffin of our marriage. The evening didn't end there. After she left, claiming she needed space, I was left alone in our house, which suddenly felt like a stage for a drama I hadn't agreed to act in. I sat in silence, the ticking of the clock louder than ever, each second a reminder of my new reality. But as the shock began to wane, a different emotion stirred within me. Not just anger, but a fierce determination to reclaim my narrative, to show that strength comes in many forms, not just in the shadow of an alpha. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about all the ways I had been complacent, how I had let life's comforts dull my edge. But no more. If this so-called alpha male thought he could dictate terms to me, he was about to meet a different kind of strength, one forged not in dominance but in resilience, intelligence, and, perhaps, a dash of cunning. As dawn broke, painting the sky with a new day's promise, I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter where I would define what it meant to be truly strong. The morning after the revelation was one of the longest I've ever known, each hour stretching into an eternity of introspection and brewing resolve. I had barely managed to close my eyes when the doorbell rang with an authority that suggested it wasn't just any visitor. It was him, the alpha male Emma had been talking about. I opened the door to find a man whose physical presence lived up to the term. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jawline that seemed chiseled by the gods themselves. His eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to assess me with the cold efficiency of a predator. "Jake," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "We need to talk." I let him in, not out of submission, but out of a morbid curiosity to understand the man who had played a part in the unraveling of my life. We sat in the living room, the very room where Emma and I had shared countless evenings, now turned into an arena for confrontation. He started by asserting his claim over Emma, talking about how she was happier with him, how she needed someone who could match her vitality and zest for life. His words were like barbs, each one designed to dig deeper into my self-esteem. But then came the twist, the ultimatum that would define the next steps of my life. "You have two choices," he said, leaning forward, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that was meant to intimidate. "You can accept this arrangement. Emma stays with you, but she'll see me on the side, or you step aside completely. If you choose neither, well, life can get very difficult for you." The audacity of his proposal was astounding. Here was a man, essentially an interloper in my marriage, dictating terms as if he were the wronged party. My initial reaction was a surge of anger, the kind that makes your blood boil and your fists clench. But I held it in, knowing that violence was not the answer, at least not the kind he expected. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the arrogance but the vulnerability beneath it. He was banking on my capitulation, expecting me to crumble like a house of cards under his ultimatum. Instead, I chose words, sharp and precise. You think you know me, that you can just walk in here and dictate terms? You see, I've been the quiet one, the one who builds, who nurtures. But that doesn't mean I'm weak. It means I choose when to fight, and now you've chosen to be my opponent. His face flickered with surprise, then hardened again. He stood, towering over me, trying to reassert his dominance. Think carefully, Jake. This isn't a game. I stood too, not to match his height, but to meet his gaze head on. No, it's not a game. It's my life, my marriage, and I'll decide how this plays out. He left with a threat veiled as advice, the door slamming behind him, echoing through the empty house. But the silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was the calm before my storm. I was no longer just the betrayed husband. I was a man planning his next move, one where I would redefine what it meant to be the alpha in this narrative. I spent the rest of the day not in despair, but in strategy. I knew I needed to outthink this brute force, to show that true strength isn't about how much space you take up, but how cleverly you navigate the space you're given. Plans began to form, not of revenge, but of reclamation, of proving that the silent, steady force could overcome the loud, aggressive one. As night fell, my resolve was as clear as the stars beginning to pepper the sky. I would show him, show them both, what a real alpha male looks like, one who leads with intelligence, integrity, and unexpected resilience. The morning after the confrontation left me with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that's thick with the residue of past conversations and the promise of new beginnings. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where Emma and I used to plan our weekends, and now it was where I would plan my resurgence. I started with a self-assessment, a brutal, honest look at who I had become in the comfort of my marriage. I had let complacency seep into my life like a slow leak, diminishing my drive, my edge. But the ultimatum from that so-called alpha male had ignited something within me, a spark of defiance and a thirst for proving my worth, not just to him or Emma, but to myself. I dove into self-improvement with a fervor I hadn't known since my early 20s. I began with physical fitness, not just to match him in muscle, but to reclaim my body, to feel strong and capable. My days were now split between work and the gym, each session a battle, each drop of sweat a testament to my resolve. But physical strength was only part of the equation. I needed to sharpen my mind too. I read books on psychology, strategy, and leadership. I studied martial arts, not for combat, but for discipline, for the mental fortitude it instilled. Every piece of knowledge was a weapon in my arsenal against the narrative that had been forced upon me. In my spare time, I connected with friends I had neglected, seeking not just camaraderie, but their insights into life, love, and personal growth. One friend, a successful lawyer, gave me advice on handling the legal aspects of my situation with Emma. Another, a former military buddy, taught me about mental resilience, the kind that keeps you standing when everything is falling apart. I also reached out to a counselor, not because I was broken, but because I needed to navigate this emotional turmoil with guidance. Through our sessions, I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to Emma's perception or the intimidation tactics of her lover. It was about my own self-worth, my values, my integrity. As weeks turned into months, I could feel the transformation. I was no longer the man who had sat defeated at that kitchen table. I was becoming someone new, someone who could face adversity with a calm, strategic mind. I started to see the world differently, not as a series of threats, but as opportunities for growth. One evening, while reflecting on my progress, I realized I hadn't just been preparing for a confrontation with him. I had been preparing for a confrontation with my past self. This awakening was not about proving a point to others. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above the chaos, that I could redefine my identity on my terms. I began to document my journey, not for public consumption, but as a personal testament to this metamorphosis. I wrote about the pain, the growth, the strategies I employed. It was cathartic, a way to crystallize my thoughts and experiences into something tangible. And then, the opportunity for a direct confrontation came sooner than expected. I received a message from Emma asking to meet, to discuss our future. But I knew the real agenda was probably set by him, testing the waters to see if I had bent to his will. I agreed to meet, but not out of weakness. I was ready, not just to face them, but to face myself. I knew this meeting would be a turning point, not just in our story, but in mine. I would show them, and more importantly, show myself, that I had emerged from this crucible not just unscathed, but stronger, smarter, and undeniably more alpha than I had ever been. The day of the meeting arrived with a clear, almost mocking sky. I chose a neutral venue, a small cafe known for its privacy and the fact that it was equidistant from our home and wherever Emma was staying now. I arrived early, not to gain the upper hand, but to center myself, to ensure that my actions would be guided by strategy rather than emotion. I sat at the back, where the light filtered through the leaves of a large indoor plant, casting a mosaic of greens and shadows across the table. I sipped my coffee, each sip fortifying my resolve. I wasn't here to fight. I was here to prove a point. Emma arrived first, her steps hesitant, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. She looked different, more guarded, less of the woman I had known. Her hair was pulled back, her face devoid of the usual warmth. She sat opposite me and we exchanged a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. "I didn't expect you to agree to meet," she started, her voice a mix of surprise and perhaps a hint of respect. "I'm not the same person you left, Emma," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I've changed, grown." Just then, he walked in, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He took his seat next to Emma, his posture screaming dominance. He looked at me with a smirk, expecting, perhaps, to see a defeated man. Instead, he saw someone calm, collected, ready. "So, have you made your decision?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. I leaned back, observing him. "Yes, I have. But first, let's talk about choices. You gave me two, remember? But there's always a third choice, one you didn't anticipate." His smirk faltered, curiosity piqued. Emma looked between us, her expression unreadable. I continued. "I've decided to choose none of your options. I won't live in your shadow, nor will I step aside. Instead, I'm choosing to live my life, on my terms, with or without Emma. And you," I looked directly at him, "you're going to learn what it means to deal with someone who fights not with fists but with intelligence." He laughed, a harsh sound. "You think you can intimidate me with words?" "No," I said. "I don't need to intimidate. I've already taken steps to secure my future. I've consulted lawyers, prepared for all possible outcomes, including the dissolution of our marriage, Emma. I've also documented everything, every threat, every encounter. Should anything happen to me, or should you try to coerce me further, this documentation will find its way to the right people." Emma's eyes widened, a flicker of realization crossing her face. The man's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "But more than that," I leaned forward, "I've realized that being an alpha isn't about domination or control. It's about leadership, integrity, and self-respect, something I've cultivated in these last few months." The silence that followed was thick with tension. I could see the wheels turning in both their heads. Emma looked at me, perhaps seeing me for the first time since our paths diverged. I'm not here to reclaim you, Emma. I'm here to reclaim my life. If you choose to come back, it will be because you see the man I've become, not because of any ultimatum. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Think about what you want, both of you. But remember, my life will move forward, with or without you. As I walked away, I felt a lightness, not from victory, but from the assertion of my own narrative. I didn't look back, but I knew that day would mark a significant shift. The showdown wasn't physical. It was a battle of wits, of character, and I had shown that true strength lies in self-mastery, not in subjugating others. The days following the showdown were a whirlwind of emotions, but I kept my focus, channeling my energy into what lay ahead. My life had taken on a new rhythm, one of self-discovery and growth. Yet the story with Emma and her alpha wasn't over. It was merely entering its most revealing chapter. One evening, as I was settling into my new routine, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a simple request to meet, but the tone suggested urgency and secrecy. Curious and cautious, I agreed to meet at a secluded spot by the river where the city's noise faded into the gentle murmur of water. I arrived early, the setting sun casting long shadows, painting the scene with an almost cinematic quality. I waited, my senses alert, until a figure emerged from the twilight. It was Emma, but she wasn't alone. She was with someone I didn't recognize at first, until they stepped into the light. A woman, her face familiar yet twisted by worry. "Jake, this is Lisa," Emma introduced, her voice low and fraught with tension. Lisa looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something, perhaps trust or understanding. "I need to tell you something about him," she said, her voice shaking. "About the man Emma's been with." I listened as Lisa unraveled a tale of manipulation and deceit. She was his ex, someone who had seen the man behind the mask of alpha dominance. He had a history of controlling relationships, of using his charm and intimidation to bend people to his will. But Lisa had escaped, gathering evidence of his abusive tactics, not just emotional, but also financial and potentially criminal. "He's not just a problem for you and Emma," Lisa continued, showing me documents, emails, and messages that painted a picture of a man who thrived on dominance in every aspect of life. "He's threatened others, blackmailed them. He's dangerous." Emma watched, her face a mix of shame and resolve. "I didn't know all this, Jake. I thought he was just different, strong. But this isn't strength. It's tyranny." I felt a mix of vindication and sorrow. Vindication for my instincts that this man was more than just a rival. He was a menace. Sorrow for Emma, who had been ensnared by his charisma and promises. "We need to stop him," I said, the pieces of my strategy falling into place. "But we need to do it legally, smartly." With Lisa's evidence and my recent preparations, we formed an unlikely alliance. I spent nights going through everything, consulting with my lawyer friend, plotting our next steps. We decided to approach this not just as a personal vendetta, but as a case of public interest, exposing a predator in sheep's clothing. The revelation of his true nature brought Emma back to my side, not as a partner in love, but as an ally in justice. We worked together, her remorse fueling her determination to right her wrongs. One night, we met with representatives from local media, sharing our story, the evidence, and the threat this man posed not just to us, but to others. The story broke the next day, a wildfire of truth that couldn't be contained. His business, his reputation, everything began to crumble under the scrutiny of the public eye. He tried to retaliate, but we were ready. Legal protections were in place, restraining orders filed, and with the community's support, his threats lost their power. The revelation wasn't just about exposing him. It was about healing, about reclaiming our narratives from under his shadow. As we watched the fallout, Emma turned to me, her eyes wet with tears but bright with a newfound strength. I'm sorry, Jake. I was blind, but now I see. I nodded, understanding that this chapter of our lives was closing, but it was opening up new ones, ones where we could both grow, perhaps not together, but in parallel, guided by the lessons of this ordeal. The revelation had not just been about him. It was about us, about resilience, about the power of truth and the strength in unity. The storm that had swept through our lives began to settle, leaving behind a landscape changed, but not barren. The public exposure of the man we once feared had repercussions far beyond our personal lives. It sparked conversations about abuse, power dynamics, and the masks people wear to control others. For me, Emma, and Lisa, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one of healing and reconstruction. I returned to my home, now quieter, but filled with a new sense of purpose. The house, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary where I could reflect on the journey. I started to write again, not just for myself, but to share my experience, to offer hope and strategies to those who might find themselves in similar shadows. Emma and I maintained contact, not as husband and wife, but as two people bound by a shared ordeal. She was working on herself, seeking therapy, and exploring what her life could be beyond the control of another. We met occasionally, our conversations shifting from the pain of the past to the possibilities of the future. She was rebuilding her life, and I was proud of her for it. Lisa became a friend, a testament to the unexpected alliances life can forge. We supported each other's recovery from the manipulation we had both endured. Together, we started a small support group for others who had escaped abusive relationships, turning our personal battles into a collective strength. My days were filled with new routines. I continued my physical training, now not out of necessity to prove a point, but for health and well-being. I dove deeper into my career, finding new motivation in projects that allowed me to lead, teach, and inspire. I also took up volunteering, working with organizations that empower individuals to stand up against all forms of tyranny, whether in personal relationships or broader societal contexts. One evening, sitting in the same cafe where the showdown had taken place, I reflected on the journey. The place now felt different, the shadows lighter, the air less heavy. I realized that the aftermath wasn't just about moving on. It was about moving forward with lessons learned and scars that told stories of resilience. I met someone new, not in a rush to fill the void left by Emma, but through genuine connection at one of the support group meetings. Her name was Sarah, and she understood the complexity of rebuilding after a storm. Our relationship grew slowly, rooted in mutual respect and the shared desire to foster environments where love doesn't equate to control. The legal proceedings against the man continued, a slow but sure process that would ensure he could no longer hide behind his facade. With each court date, I felt not just the weight of justice being served, but the lifting of burdens from past years. One day, I received an email from Emma. It was short, but it encapsulated our journey. Thank you, Jake, for showing me what real strength looks like. We've both found our paths, and I'm grateful for the shared road. I replied with a simple, always forward. A sentiment that encapsulated not just our conversation, but our lives now. As I looked out into the city from my balcony, the skyline lit with the promise of dawn, I felt a profound peace. The aftermath wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about turning the narrative from one of victimhood to one of empowerment. Life had taught me that being an alpha wasn't about dominance or the loudest voice, but about leading with compassion, intelligence, and unwavering integrity. And in this new chapter, I was ready to write my story, one where strength was measured by the lives we uplifted, not by the ones we overshadowed.